How is it that we find ourselves surrounded by such complexity, such elegance?
The genes of you and me, the genes of you and me, we're all made of DNA. We're all made of the same chemical DNA. We're all made of DNA.
Hi, you're watching DNA Today, a multi-award-winning genetics podcast where we explore everything to do with genetics, from CRISPR to rare diseases to new research. We have won the Science and Medicine Podcast Award for many years now. We have hundreds of episodes, and we really hope you enjoy these conversations where we dive into so many genetic concepts. I'm Kira Dineen, a certified genetic counselor and your host. On episode 288 and 289 of DNA Today, I talked to Victoria Gray, who was the first person to be treated with CRISPR for her sickle cell disease symptoms. Since this interview, I met two amazing patient advocates and also fellow podcasters who also have the condition and taught me more about gene therapy and alternative treatments for sickle cell disease. So I had to invite them on the show here to further our conversation and be able to share it with you listeners, so that I can learn more about these different treatments for sickle cell disease. Wunmi Bakare and Dima Hendricks not only have personal experience with sickle cell disease, but are also the dynamic hosts of the brand new podcast, ThroughTheGenes. Their show, which launched this year on World Sickle Cell Day, which is June 19th, if you don't know. Their show offers informative and a heartfelt look into the risks, benefits, and limitations of gene and cell-based therapies for sickle cell disease. And they were kind enough to take the time to come on DNA Today and, again, share their insight and their personal experiences and really be educating myself and the listeners. So Wunmi and Dima, thank you so much for coming on DNA Today. This is such a treat.
Thank you, Kira.
Yes.
It'd be great to kick off the show by both of you sharing a brief overview of your journey with sickle cell and what led you to explore different curative, transformative therapies for sickle cell. And then we'll definitely dive more in, but just to give people a sense, I don't know who wants to start us out.
I can start us out. I think for me, sickle cell was such an intrinsic part of my life. I was diagnosed at 18 months. And navigating sickle cell disease was never easy for me. I think my first major surgery was when I was 7 years old, and that was because I developed something called osteomyelitis, which is basically a bacterial infection that tends to live in the bone. In my case, it was both arms, and I had to have bilateral arm surgery just to treat that infection. So from a very young age, I already knew I was different than my peers because I would have so many bouts of hospital stays. And then I think as I became an adult, a young adult in college, there were moments where my health did fairly well. But for me, because I was diagnosed with hemoglobin SS, which is the most severe type of sickle cell disease, a lot of triggers that are applied to other patients applied to myself as well. For example, stress or infection or a drastic change in temperature. Those would always trigger a flare-up of my sickle cell disease. And over the course of my life, I think as much as I tried to separate sickle cell from who Wunmi Bakare was, I just wholeheartedly couldn't. It was woven into the tapestry of what is now my life. And then in 2015, I kind of had a nightmare come to life when I came on a 2-week vacation to see my brother in Seattle. I was coming from Lagos, Nigeria, and we had to kind of break our flight between Lagos to Amsterdam, Amsterdam to Seattle. Now, the Amsterdam flight, I had a vaso-occlusive crisis while in the air. And of course, with the severe pain, I had to be moved to the back of the plane. Doctors on board did the best they could as far as like making sure, okay, did someone else have access to pain medications that we could use that? So we used that to kind of, for lack of a better word, put a Band-Aid on what was a serious issue. As soon as I landed in Seattle, the ambulance rushed me straight to the University of Washington Medical Center. And we just all assumed it was another vaso-occlusive crisis. Top 7 to 10 days, I would be discharged, I would be well, and all would be good. But 2 weeks into my vacation, my health significantly declined. At that time, my eyes were severely jaundiced. If you had looked at me, I looked like I was 3 months pregnant, but it was because I had a bacterial infection called Mycobacterium avium complex that started in my port and then went to the rest of my organs, my kidneys, my lungs, and then my bloodstream. And doctors at the time didn't have the sufficient tests to even get them done in Seattle. So they reached out to Massachusetts General Hospital and they recommended, based off of the complications she's experiencing, I suspect it might be MAC, but again, further testing will prove. 6 weeks later, we got the test that I did have MAC. And MAC is one of those bacterial infections that you either ingest or you inhale. So you don't actually know when it's going into your system. That put me in the hospital for a period of, I want to say, give or take 12 to 24 months. I was in and out. I think at the time, the longest amount of time I spent out of the hospital was probably 6 days. That's how frequently I was in the hospital. And for me, at that time, the doctors were like, we have to speak to you honestly. We don't know if treating this infection will give you a better quality of life, but we'll do everything to fight. So with approximation of 6 months to live, I then kind of had this fire of like, if I'm going to go down, I'm going to go down with a fight. And I think all warriors can identify with that when you're just kind of like, this cannot be the end for me. What are the other options that are available to me? And so on my own, I started to research curative therapies. And I use the term transformative because now that I'm on the other side of sickle cell, I recognize it was not a finite cure. I today still battle additional complications of sickle cell disease that won't get worse, but at the same time, they won't get better. And so I reached out to the NIH and I said, look, I'm a Nigerian citizen. I happen to come to Seattle for a vacation. I've been on treatment for the MAC infection. On average, it's 18 to 24 months. The quality of my life is not improving. I would appreciate it if you guys would consider me for a curative therapy. At the time, because I was Nigerian, giving the limitations of having access to the NIH, didn't really receive any word back. So then, interestingly enough, while I was in hospital, I said, you know what, if I am going to die, I want to leverage my skills for the sickle cell community. And I'm someone with a 15-year background in kind of public relations and communications. So I said, let me reach out to a nonprofit and say, hi, I do this for a living. I would like to do pro bono PR for you. And then I reached out to, at the time, a CBO called Bold Lips for sickle cell disease. I believe they're now called Bold Plus. And when I connected with them, they were like, oh, the NIH is doing a study on leg ulcers and sickle cell disease patients. We think you'd be great. And I was like, well, I've never experienced leg ulcers. And they said the NHGRI was like, no, we're looking for all patients that have sickle cell disease, those that have experienced leg ulcers and those that haven't. For me, that was my window of opportunity, because it was the type of research that would allow me to go to the NIH for them to physically take hair sample, blood samples. So when I got there, I was incredibly blessed to have met Vince Bonham, who is the acting deputy director of the National Human Genome Research Institute. And I said, this is what's going on with my case. As soon as I landed in Bethesda, I had to be admitted into the hospital because, again, the flight caused another vaso-occlusive crisis. And I remember in the hospital just bawling and telling him, this is what I'm going through. How can you get me in the door? And he said, no problem at all. I'll introduce you to my colleagues at the NHLBI, which is the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute. And from there, they sat me down and said, well, here are your options. You can either do a bone marrow transplant, stem cell transplant, or gene therapy. And I said, at the time I was like, well, gene therapy sounds a bit too new and funkified. I don't know if I want to quite dabble into that quite yet. But I said, I do have an older brother. We're biological siblings, same mother and father. And then they said, all right, well, let's test him. Let's do an HLA screening to see if he would be a match. And I always share this because a few days to my 30th birthday was when I got the news that my brother was a match. And for me, I was like, okay, God has to be doing something behind the scenes, because the person who has loved me, who has sat with me in the hospital, who took care of me when I came to Seattle thinking it was vacation, fast forward, my life is unraveling, has been my treatment this whole time without us knowing. And so that was what kind of led to me saying, all right, if my brother is going to be my donor, I'm okay with that. And let's give this a try. And thankfully, I'm now, in a few days, I will now be 5 years old. So my immune system is 5, but on the outside, I always say I'm like a 30-something-year-old woman. But we like to claim the 5-year-old.
When you can, right?
So that's my unwavering but quite challenging journey with sickle cell disease.
Wow. So you have just, I mean, you've just been through so much to get to this point. And even from me talking to other people within your community, it takes a lot to say, okay, I really am now going to consider doing a bone marrow transplant because there are a lot of risks that are associated with that. So, and I mean, my goodness, you've been through so much. I mean, you were spending most days you were in the hospital of that time period that you were talking about with the bacterial infection. And I mean, Dima, just to bring you in, tell us a little bit about your story and background and, what your experience with sickle cell has been up to this point.
So, like Wunmi, I also had a turbulent journey with sickle cell disease. I was diagnosed at 6 months old. At the time, my mother had me at a caretaker, a babysitter while she was at work. And all of a sudden, this good baby who didn't want for anything was smiling and laughing. All of a sudden, I was crying all the time. And the caretaker called my mother and said, "You have to come get this baby. Something is wrong." And so she took me to different hospitals. A couple of the hospitals said there was nothing wrong with me to take me home. And finally, I went to, at the time, it was Boston City Hospital. I'm aging myself. Now it's called Boston Medical Center. And they were the ones that diagnosed me with sickle cell disease. And from that diagnosis to about the age of, I want to say 36, I was a patient at Boston Medical Center. So during my pediatric time there, I've had a stroke. Um, I've had my blindness in one eye. I've had acute chest several times. At least once a year, I would develop acute chest syndrome. And I've had hundreds of blood transfusions, exchange transfusions, of course, bouts of pain. The list goes on and on. I had my gallbladder taken out. I have had surgery um on my head. I've had surgery, so many surgeries. Um and this was persistent until the age of about 12. My mother passed, and therefore she was like my only caregiver. So there was another issue of being in a foster home with sickle cell disease. And because of that, I had to go to a specialized foster home. And even then, as a specialized foster child, they really didn't understand the nuances of sickle cell disease. And because of that, there was one occasion, one foster parent, I had meningitis and no one knew I had meningitis. And um, she thought I was faking, and I didn't. I wanted to kind of stay home from school. I was having a fever. I was like going to the bathroom on myself. Like I wasn't able to walk. I wasn't able to feel my legs at one point. I kept falling asleep in the car, and she said, "You know what? Let me just take you to your pediatrician." And it wasn't like a hematologist. It just happened to be my regular pediatrician. And once my pediatrician saw me, she called 911 and had an ambulance from the medical center to the ER. And I spent about almost a month in the hospital. And while I was still in the hospital, they had to find another foster family for me to go to. So in the background, there were 51As filed. There was while I was in ICU. So not only I had to deal with healing from, I'm already in mourning from the loss of my mother. I'm already like trying to get my bearings together and feel better. And now I have to be in another foster family. Um, and at the time, my hematologist, she was supposed to be on a vacation to the Cape, and she would drive from the Cape to Boston Medical Center like every day just to check on me to see how I was. And that's how committed she is. And she actually still works for Boston Medical Center. Fabulous woman. Um, but as I grew older, still I had to, so that happened when I was in foster care. And then later on, um, I was still in and out of foster homes, still had to change a foster family like every year. Um, I emancipated myself at the age of 18. I tried to be independent and go to college. I was accepted at UMass Boston. And if anyone knows about the Boston area and UMass Boston, the school sits on the perimeter of the Boston Harbor. So automatically, when I go in the corridors and if I go walking on campus, I'm in pain. So every day, I would go to school, be brick cold in January, walking through the halls and be in pain. So as a result, um, I kind of failed out of college. I ended up I said, you know what? I keep going to the hospital. I'm in the hospital like 4 times a year. At that time was 4 times a year, if it was for like acute chest or some type of vaso-occlusive crisis. And I was dating my boyfriend at the time. I was like, look, I want a kid. I want to experience being a mom. And so I became a mother very early. Um, and now he's 21. He's a beautiful headed boy, but um I also just, took it into my own hands to just accelerate my life and accelerate my happiness. Um I did end up meeting my now husband when I was about 22. We got married when I was 26. Um and we're still married. We have another child. But in the midst of that, I was still being hospitalized all the time. And then, but this time, I was sick in front of my children, and I can see that they were traumatized. I didn't understand how my health would kind of deteriorate the mental health of my children, and it was very jarring to them. And I also thought, hey, I'm not going to live till 30. And there was an extended expiration date. I'm not going to live when I'm 30. I'm not going to live when I'm 40. And so the opportunity presented itself um, to be recruited for a curative therapy. And this time it was actually a gene editing um, therapy. And I went in and I was the first person on the list. I'm like, look, I'm going to live for my babies. I'm going to live for my husband. He's so awesome. Let me just take this chance. Let me gamble and take this chance. And um, I could tell my husband was little scared. And we went forward, and um, we I was accepted into the process, had apheresis treatments. Everything was going well until I decided to go into it, do infertility and store my eggs. Um, I didn't realize how invasive that procedure was and how the hormones would do such a number on my body. So while I had one of the lumen ports, dual lumen ports in my body, it was at the base of my right ventricle, a blood clot developed, and the doctors had to pull out the port, but the blood clot still stayed in my heart. Um, I then I developed another infection. Um, they also found out I had um, iron overload from so many blood transfusions over the years. And there were so many other complications that were happening to my body. So I believe it was in November, around Thanksgiving of 2018, uh, I was rushed to the hospital, and I stayed for about a month until they decided, hey, we need to have open heart surgery to take out the blood clot. I I didn't think I was going to live. So I said goodbye to my children. I said goodbye to my husband and my friends and family. Um, but I woke up and the blood clot was gone, which was a miracle. Even though I went through all that, I was still determined to get rid of this sickle cell. I was like, okay, I'm back. let's work on this whole gene editing thing. Let's do it. There was so much desperation involved in my decision making that I wasn't really thinking about what was happening to my body. And about a few months later, after I got home finally, New Year's Eve, 2018, and we're rolling into 2019, and the investigator of the study says to me, honey, your body's been through enough. We're going to have to move on, and you can't, I don't think you can participate in this study. Um, and then there was a morning that happened after that. I was in such a depressive state because I felt like my opportunity to get rid of sickle cell was taken, I was robbed and it was taken away from me. Um, and so much time being at church and hearing like, oh, you're not healed because you're not praying hard enough. Or there's something, there's something wrong with you, or you're doing something, or you're harboring this. And and the emotional toll it took that it took on me, because I've seen everyone that was in my study, in my cohort, went through the study, and they're living wonderful lives. And they were in the newspaper, and they were healed and they were cured. And me being the first one to sign on wasn't able to have that opportunity of saying, hey, I'm cured of sickle cell disease. But despite all that, the end of 2019, the FDA approved a disease modifying drug. And then there was another hope, like, okay, let me try this because the curative therapy didn't work for me. Um, the hydroxyurea didn't work for me at the time. Nothing was working. I was still going to the hospital like 4 times a year. And thankfully now I'm on a disease modifying drug that has diminished my my times of going to the hospital from 4 to 1 time a year. So there's a significant decrease in hospitalizations, and there's a significant increase in my quality of life. I don't think I'd be, if I wasn't on this medication, I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now. I'll probably still be in the bed because of the exhaustion that sickle cell kind of came over me. Like I was always exhausted. Um, but I have a different lease on life now. I do still have bouts of pain, especially living in Massachusetts with this weather changing, and it's cold. I'm thinking about maybe having like a Jamaica house, a Jamaica during the winter. Um, so yeah, that's how my life has been affected by sickle cell disease.
Wow. I mean, both of you have just been through such arduous journeys to even get to the point of us sitting down and talking today. And I mean, thank you so much for being so open and sharing all of this. One thing that we had talked about before recording and I was being educated on by both of you is just within the sickle cell community of the thoughts and feelings surrounding the term cure being used. And Dima, I noticed you mentioned that in terms of other people that were in your cohort of, having the, transformative therapy, like with CRISPR. It seems like maybe it's a little misleading. And I will say at the top of the show, I mentioned, we recorded with Victoria Gray, who has been very much in the news for being one of the first person. And for her, it has been a cure. She has had no symptoms since. But some people still do. So, I mean, I think that's something that because in those